I'm Jamie Lynn Juarez. I'm Laira de la Vega. And we are going to bring a friend on with us. His name is David Stephan. And let's add him right now. He's a friend from Canada. He's the friend from Canada that we're talking about. For a few more people to hop on. Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
We're
Awesome.
hanging in there, yeah. Third time's a charm. That's great. Pardon that. What I'm going to do really quickly is set some expectations. If we encounter any more technical issues, we're going to go ahead and hop off and we'll just do a Zoom with you and pre-record because we need to get this information out there. I've already, just so that everybody's aware, I've spoken to David. So I know the situation, and I involved Jamie Juarez because of her incredible experience that she's had with medical kidnapping and similar nature. So I spoke with you, David, a little bit about that, and I wanted to involve her because of her unfortunate expertise. But I mean, fortunate for us, absolutely, absolutely fortunate to know her, and that's where you come in. So can you tell us, or did you want to say anything? Okay. Can you tell it, because I've spoken at length about this story since I talked to you, and this information definitely needs to get immediately. Where would you like to start? And I definitely want to touch on what happened to you in your situation because it's relative, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. I just want to kind of touch on that opposition real quickly that I know that you were experiencing today, just to make this happen. And I'm kind of feeling it myself. There seems to be something out there, kind of that spiritual warfare. And it's interesting as we're engaged in this work, how much of that we seem to experience. And so part of the thing I'm going to be touching on today is the court case I just recently covered. And it was amazing to see how literally all hell broke loose in the week and a half leading up to that court case that just about had me throw in the towel. And I'm sure glad that I was able to persist. But it's just really interesting to see the opposition that we face isn't just what's tangible before us. So anyways, so I can start anywhere really. There's a lot to the story. Who am I? Well, well, I'm from the boonies, and some people don't understand that terminology. I did an interview this morning with Ryan Martin from Australia, and he didn't quite understand what that terminology was, but I live out in the country. That's where I'm from, in southwestern corner of Alberta, right near the foot of the mountains. It's absolutely beautiful there, but we got some shift taking place in our lives where we're going to be moving around a little bit, and that was a shift, not the other word there, the bad word, just in case somebody picked up on that wrong. But anyways, I just want to clarify. So I come from a family of, I guess you'd say, freedom fighters or people that take a bold stand for the truth. And it's been a beautiful thing to grow up with, but it's also created a lot of turmoil. And I remember being a young teenager, and my father taking Canada Revenue Agency, which would be like the U.S. IRS, to task. And back when the news would actually report unbiasedly, there was headlines like tax hunt, or hunting the tax hunters and stuff like that because of what he was doing, because of their illegal actions that were taking place. But when we get into the early 2000s. My father, out of necessity, developed a natural formulation to help correct severe mental health conditions because of what my family was plagued with. And it ended up eventually growing into a business. And it was interesting because when the first study came out on it, showing that it was over 3 times more effective than your standard antidepressants, literally the next day after it aired on national television, Health Canada came in and attempted to shut my father down and prevent him from making this available to people. Now, fortunately, he wasn't driven by money. That wasn't his motivation. He was really driven by the fact that he had got the family back that literally was falling apart falling apart right in front of his eyes. Part of the story is my mother took her life after they were married for 22 years, leaving behind 9 children who had all inherited her disorder in one way or another. and she followed in the footsteps of her father, who had committed suicide about 15 years previous to that. And so my father, out of necessity, had to develop something because the drugs weren't working. So he found himself in the arena of fighting for health freedom, just to make sure that we could continue on doing what we were doing in Canada. And it was interesting because the regulatory body, being Health Canada, which is like the US FDA, at one point they got in touch with my dad and said, you know, if you want to continue doing what you're doing, maybe you just want to move south of the border. So I know a lot of you in the US, you know, are taking issue with the erosion of your freedoms and your rights, but it's equally as prevalent here. The attack on our rights here in Canada, it's equally just as prevalent as it is in the US, sometimes more so in different ways and then less in other ways. And so anyways, that's kind of where I come from. But I found myself in a whole new arena. I was always against the vaccine. I never trusted the vaccines. I come from a much different angle regarding pharmaceutical corruption, wherein we identified the issues surrounding antidepressants, and we've helped literally over 100,000 people come off of antidepressants over the last 2 decades. And we've seen the devastating effects that they can have and how they don't deliver on their promises. And so when me and my wife decided that we were going to have children, we decided that we weren't going to vaccinate, and we weren't that well versed on the vaccine issue, but we just didn't trust it based on what we had seen in the other areas of the pharmaceutical industry, and that they really weren't worthy of trust. So we didn't vaccinate, and we found ourselves kind of rammed right into that arena overnight when our son tragically passed away in 2012, our second son. He was 18 months old. A beautiful little boy, and he'd come down with what appeared to be croup, and it went away. Typically, you know, typical cold, 5 days type of thing, and he's back up and at it again. And then the next week, he starts to develop what appeared to be the early onset symptoms of the flu, and they kind of the symptoms waxed and waned. He had no fever, no vomiting, nothing like that, nothing that would alarm a parent. And at one point, we had our friend come out, who was a nurse, who was also a birth attendant. And my wife was 4.5 months pregnant at the time, so she came out to do the prenatal checkup on my wife, but also did an overview of Ezekiel to see, you know, how he was doing, and everything appeared to be normal. Checked all his vitals, listened to him with a stethoscope, breathing was normal, everything was normal. And what she relayed is that if you were to take him into the hospital with the symptoms that he has, you'd likely be turned away because there was nothing of concern. Well, the next day we end up in an issue. After he became symptom-free, he wakes up from a nap in the evening and suddenly starts developing this respiratory issue. And it was more curious at first because there's nothing like the croup, but within a matter of a short period of time, I can't estimate, it'd be within an hour of this really kind of beginning probably. My wife was at a church activity at the time because he wasn't in an emergent situation. She felt that, you know, she could go, and you know, there was no symptoms. We figured he'd be up and running around the next day. But she phones me to see how he's doing. And I said, well, you know, he's fine and all, but he's, you know, out of curiosity, he's developed this breathing pattern, but he's drinking his liquids and all that type of stuff. And so she decided to come home anyways from the church activity, and she gets back. And before we even had a chance to really assess what was going on and whether or not it actually required attention, he rapidly declined and went into respiratory arrest. Now, we live out in the country, so we phone 911 to get an ambulance as quickly as possible. I'm running down our driveway, which is about probably 75 yards long. I get to the end of the driveway. I give him the rural address. I run back in, and he's breathing again. And it turns out my wife had given him a rescue breath and patted him on the back, and he coughed up some mucus and fluid, and he started breathing again. And so I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I just phoned 911 for no reason, right? He just went symptom-free for a better part of a day here, and then he ends up with this situation, and now he seems to be fine. What do we do? Like, you know, and so I'd never phoned 911 before, so I'm kind of in shock and not knowing what to do. So I just say, you know, we're gonna drive him into the hospital, because I'd heard all the horror stories about ambulances not being able to find rural locations. And so we get him into the vehicle. We wake up our 4-year-old son and get him into the vehicle as well. And we begin driving down this gravel road, and we get about a mile down this bumpy gravel road. He goes back into the same situation again. And we phone 911, and we end up on the phone with him about 3 minutes into our call. We end up driving through a small community that we didn't know that there was an ambulance at the time. And we drive within about 100 meters of that ambulance, or 100 yards within that where that ambulance was, on the night that the voluntary firefighters and EMTs would have been actually training that night. And we drive right past there, and they never got the call. They didn't get dispatched, but instead they dispatched an ambulance from 25 minutes away. And so we meet up with this ambulance about 11 minutes into the call, and they take over the care of Ezekiel. And so they take him into the ambulance, and we follow them to the hospital. And it should have just been a few-minute drive, but they ended up, it took closer to 10 minutes. And we couldn't figure out why they were stopping, what was going on. We get into the hospital, and he's non-responsive. And we had no idea what had just taken place because, like I said before, he was basically symptom-free. There was nothing external that he was showing. On that Tuesday, the day before, the nurse looks at him when he was sick with what I would have considered to be the early onset symptoms of the flu. And, she says there's nothing really of concern. And then if you were to take him to the hospital, you'd be turned away. And now also we're in this situation and he's non-responsive. Well, turns out nearly a year later, we get charged after it took about 9 months for this autopsy report to come out that said that he passed away from overwhelming bacterial meningitis and a right pleural empyema. And now that would come with an extreme set of symptoms. A right pleural empyema is a well-developed infection that takes place on the outer wall of the lung in the pleural cavity, and it would constrict one's breathing because it becomes so thick and layered, and it just prevents the lungs from being able to expand and contract. And so anybody would have identified that. They would have seen that he was struggling for breath. And so it really added to the narrative of us being negligent parents. And so then they charge us with failing to provide the necessaries of life, which is up to 5 years in jail. And I'm looking at this autopsy report because we ordered one because we wanted to know what our son passed away from. And when we got it, I was a little alarmed when I noticed that there was this information about vaccinations in there. And I thought, what the heck is going on here? Like, this isn't relevant unless they were going to use this as cannon fodder within a court proceeding. And so, a month goes by, we're not charged, month and a half, whatever. And I'm like, oh, okay, good. No, I'm just being paranoid. There's, maybe they're just, voicing their biases and they're saying that he had bacterial meningitis that could have been easily treated with a vaccination. And then sure enough, we get a phone call in February of 2013 from the police that they had some recommendations from the Crown and that they wanted to meet with us. And so I go and I get my wife, and at this time we got, I think he's probably about 6 or 7 months old at the time, our young boy, and we go and we meet with the police, who didn't really want to meet with us and talk about recommendations. They just laid down charges straight up. And so we end up in this situation, and then fast forward just over a year, we end up in the preliminary trial. And right off the bat, the Crown prosecution is asking the medical examiner about the different vaccines that would be used and how it would, assist. And my lawyer stands up and says, whoa. I wasn't aware that vaccines were going to be a topic during this trial. And the Crown prosecutor fires back and says, actually, they're going to be a major topic during this trial. So my lawyer fires back and says, well, just to let you know, it's going to extend the length of the trial based on the fact that we're going to have to lead forward with evidence regarding the vaccinations. And so and the Crown prosecutor consented. And so they went and they met during a recess, and it was identified that what the Crown was looking at doing was setting a court precedent, or a precedent in law, that said that if you do not vaccinate as a parent, and if something happens to your child that they deem to be vaccine preventable, if they're harmed in any way, that you as a parent will be held criminally liable. So what they were attempting to do was basically subvert or skirt around the typical procedure of vaccine mandates in Canada and set a precedent in law. So we ended up hiring Tony Bark and Tetjana Obekanic and had them as our expert witnesses, and it turns out that we didn't need them because as soon as the Crown prosecution saw that we were actually taking this seriously and that we weren't going to let this vaccine issue slide, then they decided to drop it because they knew it was a losing issue. And so what we did discover during court, though, because they pushed forward with it, and it was the first court case of its kind in Canada that was really used to help establish, or not necessarily, it set a precedent. It was probably one of the greatest precedent-setting cases in the history of Canada for creating medical system compliance is what it would be, wherein it showed that, look, you decide to treat anything naturally, basically, how dare you, and we're gonna hold you criminally liable as a parent. We're gonna charge you. You know, even though there was no case of neglect, and that was identified during the court case, when the judge actually came down and said at one point, he said, you know, it's a really peculiar case because these charges are typically reserved for negligent parents, and all the evidence before the courts is that the Stephans are caring, loving, and attentive parents. And so we had no case law to reference within Canada to show a similar type case going through the courts where these charges were being used in this application. So really what it did is it set a precedent where they were now broadening the scope of the charges of failing to provide the necessaries of life, and now criminal negligence, to not just parents that are cruel and unloving and just, you know, who you'd expect to be charged, but to loving, caring parents that just don't fit within the typical ideology of the medical or allopathic route. So what they're trying to do is ensure medical system compliance through this, and they're actually holding parents to a much higher standard of care than they would a doctor. So say a doctor messes up, they're not getting charged. But if a parent messes up, or even if they don't mess up, they're going to sure make it look like you messed up, and you're going to get charged. And so that's what we found also in this next case. But that overnight really put me and my wife into the whole, hate to say it this way, the anti-vax, but really the pro-choice, not pro-choice, but you know, pro-science. Those who are actually doing their research on vaccines and have identified that there are clear risks involved, and that, you know, the efficacy is highly debatable on these vaccines.
If I could say something about the United States and how our system's kind of working here right now within different legal arenas, and how here in the United States they're trying to look at vaccine mandates. So of course we all know the infamous California, where we're going to mandate you to get vaccinated to have your children go to school, and under the school laws, so they're guarded by educational codes. There's some stipulations here on that, but that's one court of laws. It's called the Office of Administrative Hearings, where some of our lawyers are looking at obviously repelling SB 277, but when then you cross-reference it to the federal government and the federal Department of Education, they are trying to sneak in different laws. So that's one area of the legal aspect here on vaccines. But what you're describing is three separate court areas here in the United States. So you have criminal court, which is you were criminally prosecuted. When it comes to child abuse negligence here, it's under dependency court. So it's a completely different courthouse. And then when it comes to holding doctors liable or parents liable for damages, you have civil court. So for those watching, I wanted to explain that when it comes to issues of parents like ourselves that are making decisions for our children in the medical health and the health freedom movement, we're up against four types of different entities that are all on the back end, as we call conspiracy or corruption, you know, navigating together and how to get us to force ourselves into the medical mandates that they want. So I wanted to explain that to some of our listeners as we move on to the next case.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And so you want me to move on to actually, I guess I should finalize what took place with our case. It was really interesting. So we have the vaccine issue rise up, and then they decided to throw that portion out once they saw that we were actually defending against it. So we get into the court case in early 2016. In March 2016, we get in there. I end up doing jail time starting the end of June. Kind of fast forwarding, but what we got what we discovered in the court case, when the medical examiner who did the autopsy began to lie or contradict his evidence that he had discussed in June of 2014 in the preliminary trial, and that he was completely covering up the fact that the ambulance that our son ended up in, that I'd mentioned before, was ill-equipped, that they had actually proactively removed the pediatric equipment out of that ambulance in that entire zone. And that when the government took over the ambulance services, because they used to be run privately, and so there was now a governing body called Alberta Health Services, and they were regulating it, and they ended up pulling out this equipment and had done so for the previous year, which endangered the life of every child in that area if they required an airway. And so that constitutes criminal negligence. And what it ended up that evening is criminal negligence resulting in death. When my son ended up in an ambulance, that they couldn't get an airway. He went over 8 minutes without any oxygen whatsoever, which would create the brain death. He ends up in the hospital, and then they are able to support him on life support. And so what happened is during the 2014 preliminary trial, the medical examiner said, yeah, you know, going that long without air could create brain death, because they identified he had brain death. But now they're trying to say it's bacterial meningitis that created this brain death. So when we get into the 2016 trial, he's saying, no. The ambulance didn't have any impact on his death at all. He was dead before he got to the ambulance, is what they're saying. And so, which would, you know, shift the liability completely. Now, it's interesting because we learned another thing during the trial, that they became concerned about an hour and a half or two into his care during transport, when all of a sudden they start to warm him up because they had him on a hypothermic protocol. They start to warm him up and he comes back to life, and they're afraid that he's going to pull out his intubation tube, so they heavily medicate him with rocuronium, a paralytic drug. You don't administer that drug to a dead person. So he clearly wasn't dead, and even after that 8 minutes of oxygen deprivation, he still didn't have full brain death at that point. He still had the wherewithal to be able to, probably the resilience that a typical small child would have. And so what we discovered is, when we saw that he was lying, we brought in another medical examiner who was the former chief medical examiner of Alberta, who was dismissed from the office for becoming a whistleblower when she blew the whistle on the corruption that was taking place within the medical examiner's office, identifying that there was political and bureaucratic influencing taking place in regard to the causations of death. So take, for example, my case. It's quite possible that a bureaucrat would have gotten in touch with that medical examiner to say, hey, look, this is an ideal case for this, change the causation of death to this. Now, I'm putting something out there hypothetically, but a 17-page letter from actually the Alberta Solicitor General's office indicates that in fact was the case, wherein there was a lawyer that got in touch with this medical examiner, a bureaucrat in the Alberta Solicitor General's office, the day before the autopsy took place, and he profiled me with a 17-page letter talking about how risky of an individual I am because of my long history in the freedom or standing up for liberty battle that we've been engaged in as a family. But then he also identified basically what the causation of death was in that letter, as if this lawyer knew better than a medical examiner. And so it's really interesting. So,
can I ask a question really quick?
Absolutely.
Other listeners, I got a little confused because you said you were in jail. Did I miss that?
Yeah, sorry. I fast forwarded. I meant that June of 2016. So we're not there yet. We're in March of 2016 right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So
timeline that I got.
So we're still a few months out from me being in jail, which was really a vacation from all that turmoil after everything was said and done. But I'm serious. It's actually not that bad. But okay. So March 2016. We're in court, and we discover that the medical examiner is lying. So we bring in this other medical examiner who identified that there's corruption. We thought, this is an individual of integrity. She gave up her job to expose the corruption. And so we hired her, and she went into the medical examiner's office. And what she discovered was really quite interesting. First thing she discovered is that there was no scientific evidence whatsoever to substantiate that there was bacterial meningitis. None. The second thing she discovered is that there was a withheld X-ray in the medical examiner's file that showed that my son arrived to the hospital with clear lungs, which means that he couldn't have had a right pleural empyema, which takes weeks to develop to cause that breathing issue where it actually you'd end up in a crisis situation. And so they withheld that evidence so that they could make that claim and make us look like bad parents. And it was right in the medical examiner's file. And so she discovers this. And so what her conclusion was that he may have had viral meningitis. And the evidence suggested that was more likely. But for those listening, viral meningitis has far less symptoms than bacterial meningitis. And what she said is that virtually nobody dies from viral meningitis. She's never seen anybody come across her table having passed from viral meningitis, but in the rare case that they end up in respiratory arrest, if you intubate them, then they'll generally, almost 100% of the time, survive with no residual effects whatsoever. So what her listed causation of death was, it was that medical misadventure due to that improperly or ill-equipped ambulance, which puts the liability back onto the medical system. Now, we had never talked with her about this. In fact, she maintained her integrity to the point where she would refuse to talk to us. She had talked to my lawyer. They had gotten everything lined up. My lawyer had no theories to work off of. He thought that it was probably bacterial meningitis, and it was just an atypical case where he didn't exhibit the symptoms of it, but he was actually trusting in all the information. So when she came out with all this information, that was quite validating to me, because my gut feeling said, this just doesn't line up. It doesn't line up at all. A right pleural empyema, he wasn't having breathing issues, and he didn't have the symptoms of bacterial meningitis, and he had this waxing and waning of these early onset symptoms of the flu for about 5 days. People don't survive with bacterial meningitis for 5 days. It just doesn't make sense. And so, anyways, we discovered that the whole thing appeared to be nothing more than a cover-up to create this agenda where they found this infectious agent, or supposedly found this infectious agent that was supposedly vaccine preventable or vaccine treatable. And so they decided to move forward with this agenda. And so what ended up happening is the jury hears all this, and they're getting it. And they're hearing about the corruption and everything within the medical examiner's office during this trial. And so they've got it. So what the judge does, which is really interesting, is the judge basically creates a law of his own. He goes against all the previous case law. Not only was it a peculiar case where this charge was being applied to loving, attentive parents, where in the history of Canada it had never been done so before, but now, because it doesn't look like it's going to be a winning case for the Crown, he actually changes the charge to the jury to go against all previous case law, opening up the doors so that they could basically charge any parent with this charge and make it so the jury would have to find them guilty. So he backed the jury into a corner where they basically had no choice but to find us guilty, and that's actually almost verbatim the words that one of the judges in the Alberta Appeals Court said when he identified the issue and said, you know, the jury had no choice but to find this couple guilty based on that error in law. Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 judges in the Alberta Appeals Court sided with the original judge, and so that appeal was lost. We went before the Supreme Court of Canada. They had 7 Supreme Court justices look at it, and they unanimously decided in a very short period of time that it was wrong what had taken place, and so they overturned that conviction, which showed one of 2 things: that the Alberta courts are either incompetent or they're corrupt. There's no other real options. And so now I'm free and clear right now in essence, but what they do is they send it back to trial. They say it was wrong what happened. It goes back to trial. So now I'm still in the courts right now, and our trial will probably be coming up right away about June of 2019. And so we'll be fighting that off. So anyways, that's my history and how I got into this. But then I take major concern because this is setting a major precedent across Canada for, like I said before, ensuring medical system compliance or substantiating that medical system tyranny. And so when I heard about the next case, the second case of its kind in Canada coming out of the same hospital, same doctors involved, I didn't make mention of what took place in the hospital and actually how this is being an agenda that's actually being pushed down through Alberta Children's Hospital and the University of Calgary. But another case, the second case of its kind in Canada, comes out of the same hospital, same type of situation. And so when I hear about this and I see what the media is doing with it, because the media is absolutely misleading the public on it, so they're literally cheering as people are being convicted and their rights are being stripped away. People are cheering as their rights are being taken away. And so I'm like, I got to get there and I got to cover this. So there's another voice, and I got to see what actually took place here to identify what the agenda is that they're trying to move forward with. And what I saw was an exact 100% parallel to what they did with us in our case.
So this is ongoing right now because that couple was found guilty, correct?
Mm-hmm. Which is the surprising part, based on the evidence that came forward in the court.
And is there any hope for them to go up to the Supreme Court in your country or where you're at in Alberta?
I suspect there would be. You know, it's a really onerous process. It cost us approximately $1 million to get to that point, and we had to basically liquidate everything and deplete everything I mean, the house that you see that I'm in right now isn't my house. My in-laws, we're kind of homeless in a sense right now. Not to give a sob story, we're liberated. We're home free. And so we're not locked down. We're free to roam as we will. But anyways, it's quite an onerous process to get to that point. And so this couple is already depleted of their resources based on what took place. They didn't have, he couldn't hold down a job and that type of stuff because his largely because his name had been smeared already in the media. They made it sound like he starved his child to death, that type of thing. And they just did him in. They absolutely destroyed their ability to exist within society. And so I'm not sure how they'll be able to do it if they so decide to do it, if they have reasonable grounds. Based on the jury instruction, it went well. The judge was, in my opinion, on side with them. I think he saw the picture 100% clear. He made it abundantly clear to the jury that they did, basically, without saying it, that they'd have to find them not guilty. And the jury still found them guilty, which was really peculiar after everything was said and done. And so if you want, I can kind of go into what took place with that case and how the medical system actually killed this child, and they ended up taking the rap for it.
Sorry to interrupt you, just really quickly. When we spoke on the phone, you illustrated it, I mean, blew my mind. But you also talked about the nonverbal communication that was coming across from the jury and how it was unexpected, the decision and whatnot. I was just hoping that you would touch on that too, if that's all right, because people see this. This is crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, before you go, I want to try and help our people following to understanding how criminal procedures work, if you will. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been, heavily involved in thousands of lawsuits in law court, criminal court, IEP court, the Office of Administrative Hearings. So the judge, and you can probably speak to this too, will give a set of jury instructions based off of case law. And it will oftentimes dictate what the jury is allowed to determine guilty or not guilty. The judge also controls what evidence is put in and what evidence is not included, which can change the whole trajectory and picture that a jury receives on the case at hand. So I'm pretty sure you're going to speak a little bit to that on how a judge and they can control and manipulate the outcome of a trial based on what they allow in and out in those jury instructions.
Absolutely. Great point. I used to be really ignorant to it until I went through it myself, but I was always under the assumption that, hey, if a jury found somebody not guilty or if a jury found somebody guilty, you can hang your hat on that because, a judge can be swayed easily, but a jury, that's a tough thing. And that's not the way it goes at all. A judge has a lot more control.
Yep. And then depending on the court, going back to what we talked about earlier, whether it's family law or it's dependency court or it's criminal court. So here in the United States, when it's criminal court, you still are innocent until proven guilty, but you have all those factors that we just talked about. Now, when it comes to what you're describing in dependency court, or when you're accused of child abuse and your children are removed, there is no you're innocent until proven guilty. If a social worker says or a hospital worker says, and that you're done. There's no like due process. They say there's a due process, but I've been through it. I've helped hundreds of families. I work with the top lawyers in the state of California dependency court, and they call it Alice in Wonderland here. There's absolutely zero due process.
Wow. No, it's horrific. The same thing happens here where, they'll take your children and whatnot. I think it's a very similar type system when you talk about family court. They take your children, and then you got to prove your innocence before you ever get them back. And even after you do, it's quite likely you're not going to get them back once they're in government custody. And so we see the same horror stories. And unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, unfortunately, I've become aware of a lot of the cases here in Canada after going through my own situation. You got desperate people, seeking for any help that they can get. And so I've helped a few people through that, not through it, but in basically encouraging them. But we see the same type of thing here in Canada, and it's horrific. But yeah, so
it does come down to, I know, I spent $500,000. My mom mortgaged her home. Most people don't realize I'm renting a room. I don't have a place. I've been a nomad. So it also comes down to money, and then the lawyer oftentimes of who you know and how much you can afford to pay them. And it's a good old boys club too. I'm not sure how it is there, but the judges know each other, and the DAs and the district attorneys, and they all golf together, and they'll openly talk about what case they're going to settle out, what case they want to go full steam ahead with, and again, what jury instructions they're allowed, what evidence they're going to permit and whatnot. So tell us a little bit more about that story as I gave that foundation.
I'm so sorry. And then off to the side, once they have your child and it's ownership, you know, the state owns your child at that point, they get fully vaccinated and they want to catch them up on their vaccines too. So it's just a very psychotic, dangerous situation.
Or drug them. Pharmaceutical drugs are, you know, in the foster care system are rampant here, and psychoactive medications and all of those different things. So,
it's a perfect testing grounds for medical system experimentation, really, is what it is. And that's what the foster care system is definitely being used for. There's no doubt about it. Same thing here in Canada. I mean, the medical kidnapping that's taking place here, I understand it's just as rampant in the US. It's absolutely horrific what's taking place. And it's interesting to note that many of these hospitals are actually employing social workers under the guise of being there to assist you, but they're actually there as an extension of Child Protective Services right off the bat. And so you end up in there, they've already got the system in place that they can engage in the medical kidnap right off the bat. And so it's absolutely horrific what they've set up there. So this family, sorry, I was going to go into the Clark situation, right? Because it was Jeromie and Jennifer Clark that were just convicted, but you were wanting me to talk about the jury situation. And so I analyzed the jury over the period of the 3 weeks. And it was interesting to note because the evidence was so abundantly clear. With criminal negligence resulting in death, in order to find them guilty on that, the jury has to determine that the parents were responsible for the death of that child. And during those 3 weeks, even when it was the Crown's witnesses that were up there, when they were being cross-examined, the evidence kept on coming out so clear that the parents were not responsible for the death. And then they got Annie Savageau, the same medical examiner that we did, to take a look at the file. And she took a look at it, and she abundantly made it clear that this child died from the medical treatments that he received upon arriving at the hospital. And I'll go into detail about that. So the jury is getting it. And then it appeared, because I ended up having to miss it was the only portion of court that I missed for the entire 3 weeks. I missed the judge's instruction to the jury. So I actually had somebody who attended my court case for the entirety of it and actually wrote on it to give an alternative media source for my court case. So I had him attend on my behalf, and he filled me in, and I said, did we see anything like we saw in my court case or anything like that? And no, he said, no, it was abundantly clear. The judge made it clear that you'd have to find them not guilty because of the conflicting evidence and all that type of stuff. You can't put any weight on this. And so what I saw, and I saw something interesting. I saw something that nobody else would have seen because I was up on the 12th floor of the courthouse that evening while the jury had gone to deliberate. And I was hanging out by myself, and I was sitting behind a security desk, had my computer open, and suddenly the jury comes out, or at least the majority of the jury comes out. And when they walked past, it was probably about 7:15 or 7:30ish, something like that, at night. They walked past me, and they glanced over to acknowledge, and they were dodgy. And the first thing I thought of was, oh my goodness, this is like if you're confronting a small child who's just done something wrong or is about to do something wrong, and they're guilty, that they're acting like that. I'm thinking, what the heck's going on? I'm like, no, maybe they're just burnt out. They've been dealing with all this situation. I'm trying to write it off. I'm like, there's no way they can find him guilty, right? I'm trying to say that. And then about 20 minutes later, so they go down the elevators. They never came back up. I'm not sure where they went. They must have came up another set of secret elevators, or not secret elevators, but elevators that are exclusive to judges and stuff like that. And so, but they went down, and then about 20 minutes later, a reporter comes up, and she says, oh, hey, the verdict is in. And so we get into the courtroom, and what everybody saw was the jury was in a completely different state of mind than they had been through the entirety of the case. And it was almost like they were trying to be like just stone cold, blunt, suppressing something. It was peculiar, is what it was. And I'm not here to to speculate necessarily. A lot of people have done their own speculations, and I'll let people do that. But there was something off. I'll just say that there was definitely something off, and the decision was just so wacky that they found the couple guilty for the death of their child and are now facing up to 30 years in jail. And so I'll get into the detail real quick as to actually what took place with that child when the child arrived to hospital, what he was presenting with, and what ended up happening rapidly after he got into the hospital that led to his passing 21 hours after arriving there. If you want me to do that right now.
Please, yes. We need to know what's going on.
Okay, and so a lot of parents will be able to relate to this and recognize that it's not exclusive to David and Colette Stephan being charged and Jeromie and Jennifer Clark being charged. This can and will apply, especially if you're living a holistic lifestyle and you fit the bill for pushing this agenda forward to try to get people, or to send the message that how dare you try to empower yourself by taking control of your own health. How dare you not rely on us, doctors and the pharmaceutical industry, for your care and well-being. So if you fit that bill, it's a lot more likely to happen to you, because the two major cases in Canada, what's the chances that one, it's coming out of the same hospital, and two, it's coming in regards to families that live these holistic lifestyles? There's children that die all the time at the Alberta Children's Hospital, yet you're not seeing charges resulting from that. So what happened?
That's terrifying.
Yeah, and so there's clearly an agenda that's being pushed, and you have the same players involved. And so I'll say it in regard to my case. When my son got to Alberta Children's Hospital, what happened is one of the attending doctors, who is also involved in this case I'm going to talk about, she phoned poison control to try to see if any of the herbs that we had given my son would have caused brain death. So she was looking for a scapegoat to that ambulance issue. Now that failed. So then what they had to do is they had to then go and create this elaborate cover-up with the bacterial meningitis that the medical examiner's office got on board with to create that, or to substantiate that theory, even though there was no substance to what they determined. And so what happened with the Clarks is little John Wyatt Clark is 14 months old. He's breastfeeding at the time. He's eating some solids. He has chronic eczema. It flares up when he starts to teeth. And at this point, oh, go ahead.
Had he been vaccinated at all?
No vaccinations. Oh, let me give you, I'll go back a little bit further. So the crunchy parents, if you want to call them that, no vaccines, organic food, they're vegans, they're homeschoolers, home birthers, child had never seen a doctor, and they're devout followers of the teachings of Christ. So that's the main of it. And you'll see that all throughout the mainstream media and all the other media sources that are there to crucify these types of parents, going off on their own little tangents. And so you'll see them being attacked for their religion, attacked for veganism, attacked for non-vaccinating, that type of thing. And so what happens is little John Wyatt Clark in November of 2013 starts to get a little bit sick. They figure he's teething. And about 2 days into his sickness, at this point, he's not eating as much. So they're substituting some of the breast milk that he'd normally be getting with coconut water. And so, and his eczema starts to flare up. And so he starts to get cold and clammy. Actually, I'm ahead of myself. It appears that he starts to, because they got a Google search, he appears to start getting, is my lighting off, by the way?
No, you look good now. Now we look dark.
And yeah, I'm seeing it fluctuate on my end here. And so okay. So I can turn on a light here. It might help, because I'm sure it's trying to adjust for both of us. Okay. So he starts to get a black spot on his toe. And so they do a Google search November 27, 2013 at 6:21 p.m. Now, November 28th, the next day, comes around. He starts to get cold and clammy. So the mom gives him a bath and to try to warm him up, and sees that the black on his toes are actually starting to spread. It's starting to spread from one toe over a number of toes, and there appears to be a circulatory issue. And so they rush him into the hospital, and initial presentation to the hospital, he's alert, he's attentive, he's responding to pain appropriately. But they bring him to the Foothills Hospital in Alberta, or in Calgary, which is right across from Alberta Children's Hospital. and they're not the best at treating pediatric patients there. They don't have all the equipment and whatnot, and so they did try to do some treatments to him. They tried to get an IV into him. They failed, and then they tried to get an interosseous line into him, which is the alternative to an IV. They drill into the bone, and it blew out when they went to push fluids through it because they had placed it wrong. And so they decided to transport him over after the doctor had tried to identify if there was a hair tourniquet that was cutting off his circulation, because it was apparent that there was a circulatory issue. So, bless you.
Thank you.
So he transfers over. They get him in an ambulance. It's a three-minute drive across the road from Foothills Hospital to Alberta Children's Hospital. They get him into the trauma bay at 3:51 p.m. At 4 o'clock, they take the first sample of blood where they culture it, and it comes up with no culture after 5 days. So they can't identify an infectious agent. And they test for vitamin levels and stuff like that, and it comes back normal. So that's going to be necessary here, because the official cause of death is overwhelming Staphococcus aureus infection complicated by malnutrition. And so their first blood test showed that he was not malnourished in his vitamins, and his appearance showed that he wasn't malnourished. Even though he's a small child, he was quite hefty for his size. He was in the 98th percentile for his height. And so you take 100 children at his height, he would have been, the 98th or 99th heaviest child out of the group. And so he's got some meat to him. And so anyways, at 4:05, they get an interosseous line into him, and they're successful in doing so this time around, unlike the Foothills Hospital. And they start pumping fluids into him. Now, what they noticed is they did a blood gas, and that he came back showing that he was hyponatremic. So he had low sodium. He was at about 108 millimoles per liter, which is quite low comparatively to the normal range being 135 to 145 millimoles per liter. Now, the problem is with hyponatremia, is if it develops over a few days or longer, the brain adjusts. Now, that's not really a problem. It's a life-saving mechanism, and our bodies are extremely adaptive to their circumstances, whether they be, bad circumstances or good circumstances. Your body adapts. And so if your body adapts, it takes time. And so if you correct hyponatremia too quickly, you'll actually create brain damage that will likely cause death. And so the standard safety protocols for correcting hyponatremia is increasing the sodium levels by 0.5 millimoles per liter per hour. And what they did is at 4:05, they put 200 milliliters of standard saline fluid into him. And then at 4:07, 2 minutes later, the doctor goes and gives him a 400 milliliter bolus, and doesn't chart it, but documents it in her notes, and it comes out during court that she'd done this. So within 2 minutes, they'd given him 600 milliliters of fluid. Now, just do some simple math here. You got a 9-kilogram child. He has about 700 milliliters of blood. They nearly doubled within 2 minutes the amount of fluids in his body, and that alone would have created probably a hypoxic injury, because it would have diluted the blood to the point where he would have been delivering proper oxygen, and so you would have had different areas of the body starving for oxygen at that point. And then they continued on. So what happened is at 4:17, they get a blood gas reading again, and it shows that they had just increased in those 12 minutes from 400 or 108 millimoles per liter up to 115 millimoles per liter. So they increased it by 7 millimoles per liter within 12 minutes, which, if you do the math, it was increasing it at over 70 times the safe rate. And what this does is it creates a major transfer of fluids, of the intercellular fluids, into the extracellular fluid. So you have the shrinkage of these cells rapidly happening in the brain, and it actually creates axonal severing to the neurons, where you actually don't just have these cells dying, but they're actually being destroyed.
Right. Yeah.
In the pons area of the brain stem. And so it cuts off the flow of information from the brain to the body, as well as it disrupts the brain stem's ability to control and regulate all of the vitals in the body. And so at 4:17, they discover that they had just increased it way too much. So what do? At 4:18, they give him another bolus of sodium bicarbonate, which would have further elevated his sodium levels. At 4:20, he goes into a seizure. So now 15 minutes into them commencing their treatment, him presenting, getting 15 out of 15 on the Glasgow Coma Scale rating. Neurologically, he's well. He's responding to pain appropriately. And within 15 minutes of them commencing treatment, he's now into a seizure. He rapidly declines. They give him another bolus at 4:24. They start to give him antibiotics at 4:26 to treat the supposed overwhelming infection that they had no evidence of. And then at 4:30, they give him a concentrated bolus of saline fluid, which by the time that he got to 57 minutes into treatment, they had increased his sodium levels by 17 millimoles per liter, which is well above the safe limit that you would ever do in a 1-day period, let alone even a 2-day period. So they basically did what you should have done over a 2-day span, riding that limit of the highest rate of increase within 57 minutes, which would have created that osmotic demyelination syndrome in the brain and would have created, that disruption, the seizures, all that type of stuff. At 6 o'clock, he goes into a cardiac arrest, goes into another seizure at about that point, and then the next day he has another cardiac arrest and they can't sustain him and he dies. And so this is the evidence that came out abundantly clear in the court case. And so it's so peculiar that the jury could have found this couple guilty for the causation of death when they brought this child in a stable condition, in a treatable condition, and yet he dies basically 15 minutes after they begin their heavy-duty treatments, their overly aggressive saline resuscitation, as they called it, an aggressive saline resuscitation. And so now, further to that, there's a question that's going to be left for anybody who's paying attention to all the details. What was causing the blackening on the toes? Well, what they discovered is that in a CT scan, in the inferior vena cava, they discovered a thrombus, which is what causes thrombosis. It's a fibrous clot that prevents blood flow, and that alone, just that one that they discovered, could have caused that blackening in the toes. But what the medical examiner never did is checked in the lower veins to see if there was more thrombuses, to see if that was the causation of the blackening of the toes. Instead, they said, no, this has to be an overwhelming infection that he was suffering with for a number of days. Why? Because that shifts the liability off of the doctors onto the parents. They were negligent, and that was the causation of the blackening of the toes, even though the toes becoming necrotic or blackening never presented with an odor, which they would have if it was an infectious agent. Instead, the first nurse and 2 of the first doctors that dealt with him identified that there was a severe circulatory issue going on that wasn't just apparent on the edges of his toes, but it was in his foot. And so there was something going on there that was cutting off the blood supply clearly, and instead they tried to say, no, it was a severe, an overwhelming Staphococcus aureus infection. Even though they couldn't get a blood culture from the first blood sample, they did get Staphococcus aureus on the second blood sample that they took at 5 o'clock that day. And staph is well present in hospitals, as many people know. And it was admitted even by the medical examiner who did the autopsy report that could have in fact just been contamination. If it's an overwhelming staph infection, there has to be overwhelming evidence to substantiate it, and there wasn't. It looked like it could have been simply just a contaminant that got into that second blood sample. And so, and then with the malnourishment, how they identified that is that the medical examiner took blood from little John Wyatt Clark after he'd been dead for 3 days, took blood from him, had it tested for zinc, couldn't get a reading because the blood was so degraded, got a normal rating for folate, which was actually kind of interesting, seeing how it was 3-day-old dead blood, and then got extremely low levels of vitamin A and vitamin D. Rather than taking the levels that were identified during the 4 o'clock reading or the blood sample from 4 days previous when he was alive that showed normal levels, they took 3-day-old blood to substantiate that he was malnourished, to show that these parents were negligent. And so this is the evidence that was come before the court, but it was clearly abundant that their listed causations of death held no water. There was no scientific basis for it, and that the true causation of death was this medical misadventure or maybe even malintent, because it was so reckless. Like any doctor should have known that they had well breached any safe protocols. We're talking not 2-3 times, too fast. We're talking over 70 times too fast. The increase of saline that would create a major issue in the treatment of hyponatremia.
And no civil lawyers have taken a look at this in terms of trying to step in and countersue the criminal court, but what about civil? If there's so much compelling evidence on this regard that perhaps the doctors themselves were negligent, are there any civil lawyers that are willing to go after the doctors?
I'm sure there would be, and it's interesting to note that. I heard word that Jeromie Clark had actually looked into that just before the charges came down. And the charges, it's interesting, they were charged over a year after the passing of little John Wyatt Clark. And the death summary that identified that it was an overwhelming staph infection complicated by malnutrition wasn't even actually completed until over 9 months after the passing of little John Wyatt Clark. My suspicion, it takes a long time to engage in a major cover-up.
Do you know, I don't have children yet. I'm in my late 30s. This is absolutely terrifying to me. I'm afraid to bring a child into this world. And after hearing all of this, being at the CDC, watching that circus over there, I can't tell you how many times I wanted to stand up and scream, "You're trying to exterminate us." And we know that. And I know that we, you know, it's a waste of time and it was falling on deaf ears, but it's a clear plan what's going on here. It's a clear, contrived plan, and it is absolutely terrible. And I don't even, and I might not have kids, and this is absolutely terrible. I'm so sorry that this happened to you and these people.
You're right. There's clearly an agenda, and I hate to get into the conspiracy, not even theories, but I hate to get into that, for fear of some people not taking it appropriately because they can't possibly believe that the government would do anything that goes against their well-being and all that. But the evidence is so clear, so crystal clear, that it really couldn't be logically identified as anything other than there's agenda pushing here, and our children are being sacrificed in essence to push this agenda forward.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And our hearts go out to you. Thank you for sharing that, and so detailed and descriptive and very crystal clear.
Very crystal clear.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I just don't even know what to add to that. I'm still taken aback because there's some things that you said that I didn't hear on the phone with you the other day. We could have talked for 4 hours, but thank you for saying this. I mean, what can we do other than share this story to help these people with their sentencing?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've been trying to figure that out myself as to what's the call to action. Rather than just illuminating an issue. It's always a much better thing to come forward with a solution as well. Otherwise, you tend to just put people in a state of fear, and it can be quite crippling. And I spent many years, about 6, 7, 8 years ago, in that same state as I was, enlightening myself with all this information, but not actually coming forward with a solution. So in regard to their situation, on my timeline, you will see a video where I give instructions on how to write a letter. This judge was visibly appalled, in my opinion, after analyzing him for 3 weeks. He appeared to be visibly appalled, and he had a hard time composing himself after the jury came out with the conviction of the Clarks. And so anything that we can do to assist him in making the proper choice in regard to sentencing, because the sentencing... Sorry, what's that?
Can the judge do something at this point?
Well, he can in regard to the sentencing. I don't believe he can overturn the conviction that the jury has given, but what he can do is he can sentence extremely light, or he can even give a suspended sentence where it's just like, you guys have already suffered enough. You've lost your other 2 children, because they did. Their other 2 children were taken away when they left in police custody right after the passing of their son, and they haven't had them for 5 years now. And so, maybe you could take a look at it and be like, you guys have already suffered enough. We're going to suspend the sentence, which goes to the weight of the precedent that it sets as well. Because if he says, well, we're going to actually sentence you for 20 or 25 years in jail, that is attached to the precedent that's set. And what takes place is the lawyers will come forward with sentencing, and it's quite likely that they wouldn't get that type of jail time, but they could if the judge really decided to do it. But if we can support that judge in any way by writing letters, and so I give instructions on what to do, basically what to cover if you have certain concerns regarding the precedent, if you support the Clarks, if you feel that it was wrong, voice it and write that letter, and we'll make sure those letters get to the lawyers so that they can be submitted to the judge during sentencing, and that can be taken into weight as to what the public sentiment is, because criminal charges really are supposed to be in the public's interest. That's what they're there for. That's what court proceedings, these criminal proceedings, are all supposed to be about. And so the media has done a fantastic job in trying to make it look like it's in the public's interest, because the public are seeing these people that they think are monsters, and they're saying, absolutely, send them to jail, whereas they're not realizing that, wait a minute, we're getting the facts wrong. The media is deceiving us, and we could be the Clarks or the Stephans. And so if we can illustrate that to the judge, that this isn't in the public interest, even if you're in the US or Australia or wherever, send that letter in, and let's show our support to see if we can make a change there. And then second to that, as to what we can do overall, just in our everyday lives, is, you know, I was asked the question from Jason Dean earlier on in the interview today that I did with him about what are you doing to protect yourself? And I said, well, you know, in essence, like, that's not even on my mind, in essence, because the answer would be rooted in fear. And so what I want to say here is that we need to take a firm stand for the truth, that we don't just be, you know, closet truth seekers, that we don't just, you know, see something that's of, you know, grand importance and just absorb it and be like, oh wow, that's incredible, I'm a better person for it or whatever, but that we share it, that we get the word out there, that we become, that we illuminate the situations at hand, that we help shine a light on dark places, because that's the only thing that's going to make it go away. That's the only thing.
It's interesting because I remember when I was of the new Yankee Stadium a while back, right before my whole medical kidnapping and criminal prosecution of myself. There's signs everywhere at the Yankee Stadium that says, see something, say something. And it cracked me up because I own schools, I own clinics, founder of nonprofits, I write laws, I settle millions. And as soon as you see something and you say something, it's like you're toast. That's you're right. A target on your back. And that's so it's right. Like, here our next call to action is see something, say something. And yet we're like, you know, and you hear that. And it's like so many. So I think a next call to action, a lot of what we talk about is if you are scared, if you are fearful, you know, you can write our nonprofit or you can call into us, and we're those fearless, we'll be the voice for you. And then maybe we can help in some other ways and troubleshoot from off of that. But I would love to write a letter. Can we write a letter to the parents as well?
Absolutely. I mean, even if you include in that letter, the letters will be available to the parents. So even if you, you can write 2 letters if you want, and just put in the subject line that it's for the parents specifically. We can give it to them. But even just the regular letters will be made available to the parents, and they'll see it. I know for us, it was a big uplift. There was over 500 letters that were submitted in our case. To go to the judge, but in our case it was interesting because the judge actually said no, I'm not going to take those into consideration whatsoever during the sentencing. So but we don't anticipate that to be the case this time around. Our lawyer was actually quite surprised at the judge's decision on that, as typically this type of stuff would be taken into consideration during sentencing. And then further to that, you know, you talk about the fear. I want to go back to that you know, just a bit here. A lot of people, you know, they ask me the question, well, how do you do what you do? And you know, like what I'm saying right now will likely be reviewed by the Crown prosecution, as I'm still under trial. And, you know, I'm under the guise right now or under the umbrella of anything you do or say can and will be used against you in a court of law, and it will. And so for me, you know, I should have a lot more fear surrounding the situation, but there's something that's overriding that fear. And, you know, it goes back to the old verbiage of there is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out all fear. And I'm here to tell you that if you shift your focus and you actually, rather than coming at it from a state of resentment or anger, or this is wrong, we need to deal with this, if you come at it from, hey, this is going to affect my loved ones, this is going to, you know, have a negative impact on my children if I don't do something. If you allow that love for whatever you stand for to be your motivating factor, it'll carry you a lot further. It'll carry a lot more weight with it, a lot more power, and you don't get burned out either because you're doing what you love. And so for me, a lot of times, like I found myself in that courtroom and I'm reliving a lot of my own situation, and I know that, you know, I'm hanging myself out to dry by reporting on that similar court situation. And so, you know, I've got two pens with me. I've got a beautiful pen that was given to me as a gift from a friend that I typically would use to jot down stuff. And then I've got another pen that I assume it's going to come in backwards, but it was a gift as a Father's Day gift. And it says, "Our dad, our hero." Now, let's just erase the hero part. I'm not here to put myself up on a pedestal because I'm clearly not a hero. I'm just a father doing what I should be doing as a father and looking out for my children's, you know, lives and making sure that they grow up in a much better place. But it's a reminder of why I'm doing what I'm doing. That I'm not here to get revenge. I'm not here to you know, take a stab at these corrupt individuals who are seeking to harm myself or to harm my children or to harm other people who are you know, for the love of money, they're destroying you know, innocent lives. I'm not here to try to get revenge or here to you know, get back at them at all. That has no place whatsoever, because that just brings in a lot of bitterness and resentment, and it destroys my ability to be a decent human being and a decent father and husband. And so it's out of love. It's that my children need to grow up in a much better place than I grew up. And if I don't do something today, who will?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. All the great leaders, all the great influencers, civil humanitarians, most of them spent their time in jail or they're end up killed. You know, you got to stand for something or nothing at all.
But I mean, on so many levels, and you and I have talked at length, David, about everybody's religious beliefs are, but I'm certain that there's a lot of spiritual work going on, because my goodness, there's just getting here to Jamie, everything under the sun prevented me from doing this interview. I was sure that we were going to have to pre-record. There's so much more going on behind the scenes that we see with our very eyes. And it's incredibly terrifying, but, you know, we agreed to this experience in my belief that before we came in, and we're all playing a role. And if we have to walk around with targets behind our backs, you know what? If it's going to save babies, you are a hero, David.
Yeah.
You are a hero. You're saving children. And for everybody that's observing this, share this video, please. Please share this video, because these people need our help. You need to write those letters. You've got to help. You've got to engage, because this affects all of you.
Yeah.
Every one of us.
Yeah.
Please.
And hopefully other people that are, the next call to action is to keep doing interviews with you. You know,
Absolutely.
we can hopefully talk to our board and do some more interviews and start with the call to action right in the beginning and do, you know, just share your story and what we need to do to help. So I want to thank you, and thank you, Laira, for including.
Absolutely. It was appropriate to involve you for obvious reasons. Appropriate. And thank you. And I think Samantha Pinto reached out to me and connected me to you. I'm so glad. And I know that a lot more is going to come from this. And I think you and I both know that. We've talked about that. So thank you so much. Is there anything? Somebody asked a question. They said, what happened to the other children? Who has custody of those children?
Fortunately, they ended up in family custody. And so they are somewhat close to the parents now. For quite some time, they were in a different province, and the parents couldn't leave province unless they had a permission slip from the Crown to do so. And so fortunately, they're closer now that the parents can go visit, but it's an extremely tough thing for the parents to actually do that. They're torn because they so badly want those children back, and so it's a painful experience every time that they engage.
Yeah, but we'll pray too, and
Absolutely.
send lots of love and light and energy, and hold you all up in spirits. And I pray everything works out too.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you say. Absolutely. I'm like, amen. So if there's anything you want us to post or share or what have you, send it my way. I'm happy to help in any way that I can over here in California.
Yeah,
where it's hell on earth right now.
And never give up hope. You know, I never give up hope. I've seen miracles and some pretty amazing things happen. Sometimes it takes longer than others, but stay strong.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. It's wonderful meeting you today, Jamie, and thank you for all that you do. And thank you, Laira. I appreciate it. It's been wonderful connecting again, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys. Freedom. God bless. Bye-bye.